The wind was already screaming when Astrid Valen pressed her palm flat against the cabin wall. It was January the 12th, 1888, and the temperature outside had fallen past anything the thermometer nailed to the doorframe could measure. She had read it an hour ago, 42 degrees below zero and dropping. The mercury had retreated into the bulb like something alive trying to survive. She stood in the center of the room she had built with her own hands and listened. The wind hit the north wall with a force that had no precedent in anything she had experienced in 62 years of living. Not the gales off the Norwegian coast that had bent the pine trees of her childhood into permanent curves. Not the Dakota wind she had crossed through on the train. This was something beyond weather. This was the continent itself exhaling, emptying its lungs of every degree of warmth it had stored since summer, releasing it all in a single terrible breath. The wall did not move. She pressed harder, felt the logs solid against her palm, felt the chinking packed tight in the gaps, unmoved, uncracked, exactly as she had worked it in September, when the air still smelled like harvest. Felt beneath all of that the simple fact of the cabin still standing on its foundation, exactly as it had stood since August level, and true and indifferent to what the Minnesota winter was throwing against it. In the corner of the room, on the narrow bed built into the wall, Niels lay wrapped in every piece of fabric she owned. His breathing was wrong. She knew it. She had known it since the previous night, when the sound coming from his chest had changed in a way that tightened something behind her sternum into a knot she could not loosen. She had heard that sound before. She did not let herself think about where she had heard it. Not yet. Not while the storm was still at its worst, and there was nothing she could do about any of it. She went back to tending the fire, and she waited, and the walls held. 8 months earlier, she had not known if they would. The wagon that brought her to the edge of her son's claim in May of 1887 was driven by a man who had the decency not to pretend he thought this was a good idea. He unloaded her trunk and her 2 grandchildren and the box of Einer's books without comment, accepted his payment, and drove back toward Fergus Falls without looking behind him. She did not blame him. She stood in the middle of 160 acres of Ottertail County, Minnesota, in the second week of May, with $9 in a cloth envelope pinned inside her coat pocket, 2 children who needed feeding, and a piece of land that had never been broken, never been built on, and had been her son's dream for the last year of his life. Einer had filed the papers in November of 1886, paid the $14 fee, written her a letter that arrived in Fargo 3 days before Christmas, full of plans drawn in pencil and the margin sketches of the house he intended to build, the fields he would break in spring, the life he was going to make from 160 acres of free government land. He was buried in the Fargo churchyard by February. Pneumonia, the doctor said. But Astrid had watched her son work himself to nothing over the previous 2 years, trying to make a rented farm in Dakota pay, and she knew the truth was simpler than a diagnosis. He had given everything he had to the effort of surviving, and when the cold came down in late January and the temperature dropped to 43 below and stayed there for 11 days, there was nothing left inside him to fight with. He lived long enough to ask her to go to the land. It was not a request. It was not quite a dying wish. It was the specific, desperate plea of a man who understood that the Homestead Act did not care about widows or orphans, or grief that the clock had been running since November when he paid his $14, and that if no one reached the property within 6 months of filing and began the required improvements, the claim was forfeit, and everything he had died believing in disappeared with it. She had nodded. She had held his hand. She had not told him that she was 61 years old and that her joints ached every morning, and that she had never built anything larger than a shelf. Marta was 7, Niels was 5. Their mother had not survived Niels's birth. The law gave Astrid until the 31st of May to reach the property and establish her presence. She reached it on the 14th with 17 days to spare and nothing else. Halvard Nygård came across the open field from the north while she was still standing where the wagon had left her. He was 55 years old, or looked it, the kind of age that comes not from years alone, but from what the years contained. His face was the color and texture of worked leather, deeply lined around the eyes and mouth, the skin of a man who had spent 4 consecutive Minnesota winters outdoors, doing the work that winters in Minnesota required. He walked with the unhurried certainty of someone who had already decided what he was going to find before he arrived. He stopped 10 feet away and looked at her, looked at the children, looked at the trunk and the box of books and the $9 worth of everything she owned sitting in the maygrass. He said her son's name, not a question. She confirmed it. He was quiet for a moment in the way of a man measuring something. Then he told her she had no cabin, no horse, no tools worth mentioning. He told her she was 60-something years old alone in the middle of an empty field. He told her that a Minnesota winter was not what she was imagining, not the winters of Norway, not the winters of Dakota. He told her in the particular flat voice of someone stating facts rather than delivering cruelty that if she stayed, the children would watch her fail and then they would freeze. Astrid had heard harder things said more gently, and she had heard those exact words before in different forms, from different mouths her entire life. She had learned to listen to the ones who said hard things plainly, because plain speakers were rarely wrong about the thing itself, even when they were wrong about what to do about it. She asked him what he had seen. He was quiet for longer this time. Then he told her. His wife had died in the winter of 1883. His son had died 3 days later. They had been in a cabin he built himself the way everyone built cabins in Otter Tail County, the way everyone had always built them, the way the Americans built them, and the Swedes built them, and the Germans had built them, and every Norwegian who came across the water and decided to become something else built them. Logs laid directly on the ground, flat stones at the corners to keep the wood off the dirt, tight chinking, a solid roof. The standard construction, the proven method, the way it was done. The ground had heaved in the night. A January storm, a warm spell that let water seep down into the soil around the foundation stones, and then the cold came back hard and fast, and the water froze and ice expands, and ice expanding beneath a corner of a cabin at 40 below zero exerts a force that has no interest in what the cabin's builder intended. The southeast corner lifted 4 inches in a single night. The logs cracked apart at the joint. The chinking fell out in sections. By midnight, there was a gap in the wall that the wind found immediately and used completely. They burned everything they had. It was not enough. Halvard Nygaard told this story looking at the ground to his left, not at her. He told it in the same flat, factual voice he had used to tell her she had no cabin and no horse. He told it the way a man tells something he has told himself so many times it has become a recitation, the words worn smooth by repetition. When he finished, he looked up. His eyes were not angry. They were not pitying. They were simply the eyes of a man who had looked at her situation and recognized it, and who was trying in the only way he knew to prevent the recognition from becoming a memory. She understood then that he was not her enemy. He was her warning. She told him she appreciated what he had said. She asked him where the creek was. He stared at her for a long moment. Then he shook his head and walked back north toward his own cabin, and he did not look back, and she watched him go until the tall grass swallowed his silhouette. Then she turned and looked at her 160 acres, and she began to think. The stones were everywhere. She had noticed them from the wagon, the way they broke the surface of the fields in clusters and runs. Granite boulders the color of old iron flat slabs of gneiss that caught the morning light. Rounded cobbles pushed up through the topsoil by decades of frost and thaw. The farmers she had seen along the road to her claim had cursed them. She had heard the stories in Fergus Falls at the dry goods store where she had spent 2 of her $9 on salt and a small sack of cornmeal. The stones broke plows. They had to be dragged to the edges of fields and piled in walls that served no purpose except marking where the nuisance had been discarded. She looked at them and saw something that took her 60 years to be able to see. Her father, Torkel, had been a stoneman in Valdres, in the mountains of Norway, where the winters made Minnesota look mild and the ground moved under buildings the way water moves under a boat. He had built foundations before she was born that were still standing when she left. Not poured, not mortared. Dry stone, he called it, fitting each piece against its neighbors, so the weight pressed down and locked everything in place. The gaps between the stones let water drain through instead of pooling and freezing inside the wall. The whole structure could shift and settle with the seasons without cracking because nothing held it rigid. He had explained this to her when she was Marta's age, standing in the summer heat watching him work. He had explained it as if it were simply physics, which it was. The earth moves in winter, he told her. Ice grows in the soil like bread rising. It pushes up. It cracks. It breaks whatever sits directly on it. But if you lift the building above the earth, the ice has nothing to grip. The house floats while the ground heaves beneath it. She had watched him stack those stones for years before she understood what she was watching. She had not touched a stone since she was 12 years old and left her father's house. She was 62 years old in an empty field in Minnesota, and she was looking at more stones than she could count, and she knew exactly what she was going to do with them. The first stone she chose weighed perhaps 40 pounds. She carried it herself, both arms wrapped under it, the weight settling into the muscles of her lower back in a way that would still be speaking to her 3 days later. She carried it to the spot she had paced out and marked with a stick, the center of what would become her claim, and she set it down on the grass. Marta watched from 10 feet away, with the serious attention she brought to everything. "What is that for?" she asked. "Foundation," Astrid said. She went back for another stone. By the end of the first day, her hands were raw, and her back had formed opinions about the day that she chose not to listen to. By the end of the first week, she had a pile of stone that stood shoulder high and spread across a circle 8 feet in diameter, and her palms had begun to form the preliminary hardening that would eventually become callous. The neighbors noticed. Petter Hauge rode over on the third day on a solid bay horse that moved with the confidence of an animal that had never been asked to do anything it could not do. Hauge was a practical man in his mid-40s who had arrived in Otter Tail County 2 years earlier and built his cabin in 3 weeks using the standard method. He measured success in acres broken and bushels harvested, and he had the particular certainty of someone who has survived long enough in a new place to believe he understands it. He dismounted and walked around her stone pile without speaking, the way a man walks around something he is trying to classify. Then he told her what she was doing wrong. It would take weeks, he said. She did not have weeks. She had 4 months until first hard freeze, and in those 4 months, she needed walls and a roof and a garden in the ground and firewood stacked against the coming cold. He counted the tasks for her methodically, the way you count things for someone who has not fully grasped the arithmetic. Every hour she spent moving rocks was an hour not spent on the things that determined whether her grandchildren were alive in February. She did not stop moving rocks. She told him about the standard construction, about what happened to cabins built logs on earth in Minnesota winters. She asked him whether his own door stuck when he closed it. His face changed. His door stuck badly. Had since the second winter. He had to lift and push simultaneously to get the latch to catch. And the gap at the bottom was wide enough for cold air to pour through no matter how many rags he stuffed against it. He said that was just settling. All cabins settled. She said hers would not. He looked at the pile. He looked at her. He looked at Marta and Niels sitting in the shade of the stones eating hard bread. He told her she was wasting time. That time would cost her grandchildren their lives. He told her about the Gustafson family 3 miles west, whose claim had failed the previous year, whose cabin still stood with a collapsed roof but salvageable walls. He offered to help her haul the lumber. Halvard Nygaard would help. They were not monsters. She said she did not want the Gustafsons' cabin. She wanted her own. He shook his head and mounted his horse and rode away, and she went back to moving stones. Solomon Birch arrived at the end of June on a fine horse with a clean coat and eyes that were always adding something up. He was the kind of man who existed at every frontier, the one who held the mortgages and extended the credit and arrived at the precise moment when someone was most desperate. He had been in the territory for 9 years, and he knew with the accuracy of long practice which homesteaders were likely to hold and which were likely to break, because the ones who broke often left improvements behind that could be acquired for a fraction of their worth. He rode slowly around her work site, examining the 8 shallow pits she had dug in a rectangle 16 feet by 20, examining the stone piers she had begun building in each pit, the careful dry stack construction rising 2.5 feet from the bottom of each hole toward the surface. 4 piers complete, 4 in progress, each one solid enough to push against with both hands and not move. He pushed against one. It did not move. He told her he had come to offer a loan, enough for lumber, enough for seed, enough for a mule to help with the heavy work. The interest was reasonable by his standards, which meant 12% annually, and she would have 5 years to pay it back, which meant 5 years of interest compounding against a claim that would produce almost nothing in its first year. She asked what happened to the improvements if she could not pay. He smiled and told her she would have a real cabin, glass windows, a proper floor. She looked at the 8 stone piers rising from the Minnesota earth, each one fitted by her own hands, each one resting exactly as her father had taught her, weight pressing down, locking everything in place, gaps letting water drain instead of pooling and freezing. She told him no. He rode away. He said he would see her in the spring if she was still here. The if was not a question. She found the tools on a night in late June. She had been in the trunk twice since arriving, once to take out the winter clothes she had repacked for storage, once to find an extra needle for mending. She had not emptied it completely. It was not the kind of trunk you emptied. It was the kind you carried everything in and unpacked as needed. She was looking for a piece of cloth to patch the knee of Niels's trousers. She had gone through the top layers and the middle layers and reached the bottom. The oldest things, the things that had traveled from Norway to New York to Fargo to this field, the things she had stopped consciously knowing were there because they had always been there, and she expected them to always be there. Her fingers found the oilcloth before she understood what it was. She lifted it out. It was heavier than it should have been. Wrapped carefully, multiple layers sealed at the edges with the deliberate attention of someone who intended it to survive a long time. She unwrapped it slowly by the light of the oil lamp. The tools inside were her father's. She recognized them one by one: the small hammer with the worn handle, the chisels in 3 sizes, the flat-bladed tool he used to test the level of a surface, the iron pins for alignment. She had watched him use every one of these tools across her entire childhood. She had handed them to him when he needed them before she was old enough to understand what he was building. She turned the hammer over in her hands. The handle was smooth where his palm had worn it. She could feel the exact shape of the grip his hand had made over decades of work. She sat on the floor of the tent she had rigged from canvas and prairie grass while she was building the piers, and she held her father's hammer, and she understood what had happened. He had packed these tools into the bottom of her trunk 32 years ago, before she boarded the ship, before the long crossing, before any of the decades that followed in America. He had packed them without telling her, without explanation, without any conversation she could remember about why they were there. He had been dead for 11 years. He had known 32 years ago that she might someday need them, that somewhere in the future she could not see, in a place he could never have named, in circumstances. Neither of them could have predicted there would come a moment when her father's knowledge and her father's tools were exactly what was required. He had simply made sure they were there. She sat on the hard ground with the hammer in her hands and the lamp burning low and the children asleep in the corner, and she cried. Not from grief, though grief was part of it. Not from relief, though that was part of it too. She cried from the particular sensation of understanding fully and in the body, rather than merely in the mind, that she was not alone in this empty field. She had not been alone for 32 years. She just had not known it. By mid-July, all 8 piers were complete. She had worked them from the bottom up, largest stones at the base progressively smaller toward the top, each one fitted against its neighbors without mortar, so the weight pressed down and locked everything in place, and the gaps let water drain through instead of collecting and freezing. She had used her father's chisels to shape the stones that needed shaping. She had used his flat tool to test the level of each pier's surface before she moved to the next course. They stood in a perfect rectangle, 16 feet by 20 feet, rising 2.5 feet above the surrounding ground. 8 columns of dry stacked stone, each one solid enough to bear a corner of a building, each one able to flex with the season without cracking because nothing held it rigid. She walked among them in the long July evening, running her hand along each one, pressing testing. None moved. The weight held everything in place, just as her father had promised. Just as his father had promised before him. Just as the buildings in Valdres that had been standing for 50 years, 100 years, were still standing because the men who built them had understood something simple and true about how the earth behaved in winter, something that the settlers of Minnesota had not yet learned because they had not yet spent enough winters here to learn it the hard way. The hard way was coming. Astrid did not know exactly when or exactly how bad, but she had lived 62 years, and she understood how things accumulated. She understood that the earth did not make exceptions for people who were unprepared. She understood that what she had built in these 8 stone piers was not just a foundation for a cabin. It was the difference between surviving and not surviving, between her grandchildren growing up and not growing up, between Einar's dream dying in the Minnesota soil and Einar's dream outlasting the winter that killed him. She stood in the evening light among the 8 piers she had built with her own hands and her father's tools and 32 years of waiting knowledge, and she felt something she had not let herself feel since February. Something that was not quite hope, but was not hope either. Something that said, this is real. This will hold. Marta came and stood beside her. Will it work? The girl asked. Her grandmother looked at the stones, felt their stillness against her palm. Your great-grandfather built like this in Norway, she said. His buildings are still standing. We are still standing. That is what the stones are for. Marta looked at the piers for a long moment with the serious eyes she brought to everything. Then she picked up a small, flat stone from the pile of chips and offcuts at the base of the nearest pier. She fitted it carefully against the existing face of the stone above it, pressed it in, tested it. It held. Astrid watched her granddaughter fit the stone and press it in, and she felt the thing that had been missing since February return to its place in her chest. Tomorrow the logs would begin, and the walls, and whatever came after the walls. But first, in the long July evening light in the middle of 160 acres, that Einar Valen had died believing in a 62-year-old woman and a 7-year-old girl stood among 8 stone piers that would hold for 66 years and looked at what stubbornness and memory in a father's long patience had made. The Minnesota summer moved in the grass around them. The whole long autumn was still ahead, and beyond the autumn, the winter. The winter that would tell them everything. The axe was the one thing Einar had bought new. Everything else he had acquired used the tools borrowed or second-hand, the seed purchased on credit, the plans drawn on whatever paper was available. But the axe he had bought new from a smith in Fargo, a good steel head with a handle of straight-grained hickory, and he had written about it in his last letter the way a man writes about something he is proud of and does not quite want to admit being proud of. Astrid had carried it from Fargo in the trunk alongside the books and the winter clothes, and unknown to her until June her father's at tools. She took it into the woods on the first Monday of August. The timber along the creek that ran through the northwest corner of her claim was not what a Norwegian timberman would have called timber. Cottonwood, mostly fast-growing and soft-hearted, prone to warping as it dried. Box elder along the lower banks, soft and rot-prone. A scattering of oak further back from the water, dense and difficult, the kind of wood that resisted the axe the way it resisted everything else that tried to change its nature. She selected a cottonwood about 10 inches in diameter, spat on her palms the way her father had always spat on his before beginning, and swung. The axe bit. Wood chips flew. She swung again. 2 hours later, the tree fell. She stood beside it and breathed and pressed her hands against her lower back and did the arithmetic she had been doing since July. The tree was barely 15 feet of usable length once she trimmed the branches. She needed logs long enough to span the full 16 feet of the cabin's width, and she did not have them. She would have to join sections at the piers instead of running single logs the full length of each wall. More joints meant more chances for gaps. More gaps meant more cold. She began trimming the branches. She dragged the log back to the building site through the August heat, the stripped trunk leaving a furrow in the dry grass. It took most of the afternoon. One log, one afternoon. She needed 60 logs at minimum for walls 8 courses high, and she had 90 days before the first hard freeze, and 60 days of log cutting, left exactly 30 days for raising the walls, building the roof, chinking the gaps, gathering 5 cords of firewood, and doing the 100 other things that determined whether a family survived their first Minnesota winter. The arithmetic was impossible. She went back into the woods the next morning. By the 3rd week of August, she had 16 logs at the site. Her hands had changed completely by then. The blisters of the stonework had healed, and the callus that replaced them had been worked through again by the axe and the dragging. And what remained now was something that no longer precisely qualified as skin, a surface hardened past its original purpose into something more functional and less comfortable. She stopped noticing the pain the way you stop noticing a sound that has been present long enough to become part of the silence. She worked from before first light until she could no longer see clearly enough to work safely. She ate less than she should have. She had $9 in May and had spent carefully, but carefully was not the same as enough. And feeding 2 children through a Minnesota summer on the margins of what was possible left the margins for herself very thin. She knew her ribs were more visible than they had been in May. She knew the dress she had worn to travel hung differently than it had. She did not stop. Marta carried waters from the creek without being asked. Niels gathered the smaller branches for kindling with the serious application of a 5-year-old who understood that the gathering of kindling was his specific and important contribution to the larger enterprise. In the evenings, they sat together inside the canvas shelter Astrid had rigged between two posts near the pier foundation, and she read to them from Einer's books by the light of the oil lamp until the lamp oil ran too low to justify continuing. On the 22nd of August, Halvard Nygaard came and stood at the edge of her claim and watched her drag a log out of the tree line. She did not stop to acknowledge him. She kept pulling. He watched until she reached the building site and set the log down alongside the others. Then he walked over. He stood looking at the 16 logs arranged by size near the foundation. He looked at the 8 stone piers waiting. He looked at her face, which told him things she was not saying. He said she needed a raising bee. She said she knew how a raising bee worked. He said the neighbors would come, even the ones who thought she was wrong, because refusing to come to a raising bee was the kind of thing that marked you in a community of people who needed each other to survive winters of the sort that Minnesota produced. She said the neighbors had decided she was either proud or crazy, and that neither quality historically attracted raising bees. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he would come. One man he acknowledged was not much, but it was more than none. She looked at him, this weathered farmer who had told her in May that her grandchildren would freeze, who had walked away without looking back. She asked him why. He was silent long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said she was still here. Everyone had said she would quit by now. Birch had been telling people in Fergus Falls she would be gone by September. Hodge thought she had lost her mind, but she was still building, and the children were still alive, and he had seen a great many people quit, and not many people stay when every voice around them said to go. He looked at the stone piers. He said he had not seen foundation work like that since his grandfather's farm in Sinfjell. Dry stone, no mortar, the earth moves, so you build something that moves with it. He almost said something more, but did not. He told her Saturday he would talk to Hauge. Hauge was a stubborn man, but not a cruel one, and he would come even if only to prove her wrong. She said Saturday. He walked back north, and this time she watched him go with something different in her chest than what had been there in May. Petter Hauge arrived before dawn on Saturday. She heard him before she saw him. The particular sound of a man who has made a decision and arrived with it already made the footsteps of someone who is not going to explain himself and expects not to be asked to. He came across the field from the east with an axe over his shoulder and set it against the nearest pier without speaking, and looked at what she had built. He looked for a long time. Anders Lindqvist came 20 minutes after Hauge the young bachelor from the claim to her east, the one who had said almost nothing in any of their brief exchanges, but had watched her work with a quality of attention that suggested he was taking notes. He carried his axe and a coil of rope and positioned himself at the far end of the log pile and waited. Halvard arrived last with a second axe and a draw knife for smoothing the notches, and the calm efficiency of a man who had raised cabins before and knew how the day was going to go. The 4 of them worked. She kept pace with the men through the morning, notching logs, positioning them on the piers, fitting the corners with the interlocking saddle notch that Halvard demonstrated on the first course, and she adapted immediately and precisely, her hands learning the angle and depth of the cut within the first 3 logs. Hodge said nothing about this, but he noticed. She could see him noticing. By midday, the first course of logs sat on the stone piers, and the thing that had existed only in her mind since May became visible to anyone standing in her field. The gap between the lowest log and the ground, 18 inches of open air between the wood and the earth, looked wrong to everyone except her. It looked like a mistake. It looked like a structure that had been set too high that would topple in the first real wind. Hodge looked at that gap for a long time. Too high, he said finally. All the work on that foundation, and the whole thing is sitting up in the air like it's afraid to touch the ground. Halvard looked at him. Hodge shook his head and went back to notching. By evening, the walls were 4 feet high, 4 full courses of logs locked at the corners, rising from the stone piers, with the kind of solidity that comes from fitting things correctly rather than from mortar or fastening. The structure was already obviously different from anything else built in Ottertail County. The corners were tight, the log faces were true. The whole thing sat on its foundation with the settled permanence of something that intended to be there for a very long time. Halvard walked the perimeter at sunset, testing joints, pushing corners, checking the level of the top course, with the kind of attention he gave to things that actually needed it. "It is solid," he said. "Better than solid." Hoge said nothing, but he stopped shaking his head. They came back Sunday. By Sunday evening, the walls were 8 courses high, and the ridge beam was up, and the split-pole roof was half covered with sod, cut from the prairie layered over the tar paper she had traded her funeral dress for the previous month, the one good dress she had brought from Fargo, because she had known even then that the things you kept for special occasions were rarely the things you actually needed. Astrid fed the 3 men that night from what she had, which was thin soup stretched with the last of the salt pork and flatbread made from the cornmeal she had rationed since May. It was a poor meal and everyone knew it, and no one said so. Hauge ate 2 bowls without comment and complimented the bread, which cost him something. She could see it cost him, and she accepted it without making it larger than it was. When they left in the dark, walking back across the field to their own claims, she stood in the doorway of the cabin that now had a door. A real door salvaged from an abandoned structure on the road to Fergus Falls and hung on leather hinges, and she looked at what 4 people had built in 2 days. It was not finished. The chinking needed days more work. The floor was packed earth. The single window facing south was covered with greased paper rather than glass. The stovepipe rose through the roof at an angle she was not entirely satisfied with. There was no garden, no woodpile worth the name, no feed for animals she did not yet own. But it was a cabin, her cabin, on her foundation, built from timber, cut from her own land, by her own hands, in the hands of 3 men who had shown up on a Saturday, one of them specifically to watch it fail. She went inside and built a small fire in the iron stove and watched the cabin warm, and she thought about Einar, and she thought about her father, and she thought about the things that get passed down through families, whether anyone intends them to or not. September and October were about chinking. The logs had settled onto the piers through August, shifting slightly as greenwood dried and found its final position, and every shift created new gaps between courses that needed to be addressed. She mixed clay from the creek bank with dried grass and worked it into the gaps in sections, returning to each section after it dried to check for cracking and fill what the drying had opened. She rechinked twice in September, once more in October. The door hung true throughout. She checked it every morning with the flat of her father's level tool, the simple iron bar with the reference mark filed into its face by his hand decades ago. The door checked level every morning. The floor checked level every morning. The piers beneath the floor checked level every morning. She stacked firewood against the north wall, 3 cords by the end of October. She needed 5. She had run out of autumn to cut more. 3 cords would have to be enough, or it would not be enough. And she had done what she could do, and what she had not been able to do was done and could not be undone, and she would manage the wood she had with the precision of someone who understood exactly how much she had and exactly how much each day required. The first frost came on the 2nd of October. She woke before light to find the grass outside the cabin window wide and stiff, the moisture of the night frozen into individual crystals on each blade, the world briefly transformed into something that looked like it had been painted by someone who was not sure how cold looked and had overcommitted to the literal. She lit the stove and watched the cabin warm. She checked the walls for drafts with a candle, moving the flame slowly along every joint, every chinked gap, watching for the flutter that would mean cold air finding a path through. The flame moved with her hand. Nothing else moved it. She checked the floor. Dry. She checked the door. It swung freely, latched cleanly, fit its frame the way a door was supposed to fit, and almost never did after the first winter in Ottertail County. A week later, Petter Hauge came. He walked around the outside of the cabin, first his boots crunching on the October ground, his eyes going to the base of the walls, where the lowest log sat on the stone piers with 18 inches of clear air between the wood and the frozen earth. Ice had formed on the ground overnight, and the crystals caught the morning light in the gap, glittering on the soil that could not reach what it was trying to reach. He bent down and examined the nearest pier, pressed against it with his palm, stood and looked at the cabin wall directly above it, bent down again. Then he came to the door and knocked, and she opened it. He stood in the doorway looking at the interior, the walls unmarked by frost, the floor level and dry, the door frame square in its opening. He crossed to the opposite wall and pressed his palm against the chinking and held it there, feeling for the cold that should have been seeping through by now in any conventionally built structure, and was not seeping through here. He said there was no frost damage. She said no. He said his own cabin had cracks in the chinking already. The southeast corner had risen almost an inch. The door scraped when he closed it. She said nothing. He looked at the gap beneath her walls, that 18 inches of open air that everyone had told her was wrong, that looked like a mistake and was the opposite of a mistake. He said his grandfather had built like this. In Telemark in the mountains, piers of stacked stone, the building raised above the ground. He had thought it was old country foolishness when he came to Minnesota. He had thought the Americans knew how to build for American conditions. He looked at the floor. He said perhaps he was wrong. She said perhaps. He met her eyes. Wait until January, he said. Wait until the temperature drops to 40 below and the wind cuts through everything, and we will see if your rock pile was worth the trouble. He walked away without waiting for her to answer. She watched him go, this stubborn, practical man who had come to prove her wrong and was beginning to suspect he might not be able to, and she thought about all the Peters in all the places, the men who built the Standard Way, because it was the Standard Way who passed the Standard Way on to the next person who came along, and about what it cost when the Standard Way was wrong. She went back inside and fed another split log to the stove. December arrived with temperatures that dropped to 12 below zero and stayed. The rhythm of survival established itself. Wake before light, stoke the fire from the overnight coals, melt snow for water because the creek had frozen solid by the second week of December, and the well she had dug in September had gone to ice. Cook thin porridge for the children. Work through the short daylight hours. Retreat inside as darkness came, which came early now, by 4 in the afternoon, the light already failing, the long Minnesota night beginning its slow expansion. The cabin held. No drafts penetrated the walls. The floor stayed dry, while ice formed on the ground outside, in patterns she could see from the window. The frost heave at work in the soil, pushing stones upward through the earth, buckling the surface in ripples and ridges that spread across the field like something breathing beneath the ground. Halvard's cabin, she knew from his brief visits, had developed 3 new cracks in the chinking. Hoja's door had stopped closing entirely. He had nailed a piece of burlap across the inside of the doorframe. Her door closed. Her door had always closed and continued to close every morning and every evening, and every time one of the children came through it, swinging freely on its leather hinges, latching clean, fitting its frame the way her father had said a door should fit if the foundation beneath it never moved. She rationed wood with the precision of someone who understands the relationship between what they have and what they need, and what happens when the first runs out before the second is satisfied. 1 split log every 90 minutes through the night, banking the fire at the precise point where it would hold coals until the next feeding, without consuming more than the calculation allowed. 2 cords remaining after Christmas. She would need them to last until March. It would be close. Then January arrived, and the morning of the 12th came, and the world did something that nothing in her experience had prepared her for. The temperature rose above freezing before noon. It was January 12th, 1888, and the thermometer she had hung outside the south-facing window read 34 degrees at 11 in the morning, and children who had not been outside without their heaviest coats in 6 weeks were running in the fields with their faces turned up to something that felt improbably absurdly like spring. She heard them from inside the cabin. She stood at the window and looked at the sky to the northwest. Her father's voice came back to her clearly, the way it sometimes came back in moments when she needed it most. He had described this sky to her once, this particular combination of clearing low cloud and building upper atmosphere, the light that came with it, the quality of the air that preceded it. He had described it as the most dangerous sky a person could see, in winter more dangerous than blizzard, more dangerous than sustained cold, because it was the sky that made you believe the danger was over when the danger was in fact arriving at its worst. The warm air came from the south and moved the cold air out temporarily, and while the warm air sat over the land, water seeped down into the soil around every foundation in the county, into every gap around every corner. Stone into every crack in the packed earth beneath every cabin built the Standard Way. And then the cold came back, and the water froze, and ice expanding in the soil exerted pressures that no cornerstone had ever resisted, and no foundation laid directly on the ground had ever survived intact. She had understood this since July, since long before July. She went to the door. Marta, she called. Nils, Marta looked up from wherever she was 100 feet away, her face showing the particular expression of a child being called in from something she was enjoying. Now Astrid said. The quality of her voice brought Marta moving immediately. Niels came running from the direction of the snow fort he had been excavating for a week, his face bright with the cold-warmth combination that came from being outside in January above freezing. They came through the door, and she closed it behind them and latched it and fed the stove from the woodpile, more than the calculation allowed for the middle of the day, and the three of them sat in the cabin that had been built on 8 stone piers, while the world outside decided what it was going to do next. She could hear her neighbors. Through the cabin walls, muffled and distant, the sounds of people enjoying something that felt like an unexpected gift. Doors opening, children's voices, the particular sound of people who have been inside for too long, finally getting out, who have relaxed defenses they had been holding tense for weeks. The sound stopped at 2 in the afternoon. Not gradually, not a slow shift in weather from one condition to another. The change happened the way a door closes, a specific moment of before and after the air outside the cabin, going from something that felt like possibility to something that felt like punishment within the span of one breath. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in the time it took her to cross the cabin and look at the thermometer through the window. The wind hit at the same moment, coming from the northwest at a speed that she had no frame of reference for, that she could not compare to other winds, because other winds were not this. Ice crystals drove against the south wall of the cabin, with a sound like sand thrown at close range, each crystal small and hard, and moving at 40, 50, 60 miles an hour. The temperature was still falling. She went to the woodpile against the north wall and began calculating in a new way, not for an ordinary January night, but for whatever was coming down from the northwest with the weight of the whole continent behind it. The cabin's walls did not move. The stone piers beneath the floor held their position exactly as they had held it since August, each one bearing its load of corner and wall, each one sitting in the shallow pit she had dug for it in the Minnesota clay, the weight of the logs pressing down and locking the fitted stones in place, just as her father had always said the weight would. Outside, the temperature dropped 53 degrees in 7 hours. By nightfall, it was 11 below zero. By midnight, it was 29 below. By dawn of January 13th, the thermometer read 42 degrees below zero, and the wind was still coming from the northwest, and the world had become something that had no longer anything to do with human comfort or human expectation. But inside the cabin, on the foundation of dry stacked stone, a 62-year-old woman and 2 small children were alive and warm enough. And Niels, lying in his corner by the stove that she was feeding carefully against all the arithmetic of survival, had begun to cough. It started small, a dry rasp in the back of his throat that he tried to suppress, turning his face into the pillow. When the spasm came, the particular discretion of a sick child who does not want to worry the adult responsible for him. She noticed before the second cough. She crossed the cabin and pressed her palm to his forehead. The heat radiating from his skin moved through her hand and into her chest and settled there as something that had no name in English and no name in Norwegian, and was only the specific ancient fear of a woman who had already lost her son to the sound that was beginning in her grandson's chest. She had heard it before. She had heard it in February of 1887 in a room in Fargo, in the chest of a man who had given everything he had to survive and had nothing left when the cold finally reached him. Einar had made that exact sound, that wet, resonant sound that meant the lungs were involved in a way that went beyond ordinary winter illness. She moved the stove's damper open and fed it 3 split logs instead of 1. She wrapped Niels in every blanket she owned, every piece of clothing that could be pressed into service as insulation, and she sat beside him and held him and listened to the storm outside hammer against walls that did not move. The walls did not move. The floor stayed dry beneath her feet. The door held its frame exactly as it had held its frame since the day Halvard hung it in August. The cabin was doing everything she had built it to do, and it was not enough, or it was not yet enough. Outside, the temperature was 42 below zero, and the wind was screaming, and somewhere out there in the white howling dark were her neighbors in their standard cabins with their standard foundations, and she did not know what was happening to them, and she could not reach them, and there was nothing to do but hold her grandson and feed the fire and wait for whatever was coming next. She added another log. The fire caught. The warmth moved outward. The walls held. She waited. The blizzard did not stop. For 3 days, the wind came from the northwest without pause, each gust hitting the cabin like something that had made a decision about what it wanted and was pursuing that decision without deviation. The snow drove horizontally so thick and fine that the air itself ceased to have meaningful transparency. The world beyond the cabin walls reduced to a white pressure, a moving wall of frozen particles that found every gap in every structure in Ottertail County and entered without permission. Astrid kept the stove burning at the minimum level that kept the water bucket from freezing solid. She had calculated this level in September, burning test fires and counting logs and measuring how long the room took to cool after each feeding. The number she arrived at then was the number she used now. One split log every 90 minutes through the night, the cabin holding at a temperature that kept the children alive, and the ice off the inside of the walls, and nothing more comfortable than that. She fed the stove. She checked Niels. She fed the stove again. His fever had climbed through the first night and peaked somewhere in the small hours of the second morning at a level that she could feel radiating from his skin before she touched it, the particular intensity of a fever that is working at the limits of what a small body can sustain. She bathed his forehead with water, cooled from the bucket. She held him upright when the coughing came because Einar had breathed easier upright, and she had learned that in February of 1887, and she would not forget it. Marta sat in the corner by the stove and read aloud from the Norwegian Bible that had belonged to Astrid's own grandmother, the leather cover cracked and worn from 4 generations of hands, the words of the old Psalms filling the cabin in a thin, steady voice that did not waver even when she stumbled over the archaic phrasing. She read because her grandmother had asked her to read. She read because reading was something she could do, and a 7-year-old who understands that the situation is serious will always find something she can do and do it without being asked twice. Astrid listened to her granddaughter's voice and tended the fire and watched Niels breathe and waited for the storm to tell her what it intended. On the second night she heard it, a sound from outside from somewhere to the northeast that had nothing to do with wind, a sharp crack like a rifle discharged close, then silence, then another crack further away. She knew what it was. She had heard her father describe it, the sound of trees splitting in extreme cold, the moisture inside the wood freezing faster than the fiber could accommodate the pressure building until the only resolution was fracture. It happened at 40 below or colder. It meant the temperature was still dropping. She thought about the sound and what it meant, and then she thought about the sound a cabin wall makes when it separates at the corner joint, which was a different sound but came from the same principle. And she thought about Halvard's description of the night in 1883, and she thought about the Halverson family 2 miles to the southeast in their standard cabin with its standard foundation, and she thought about a 4-year-old child with a blue ribbon in her hair. She fed the stove. She did not sleep. On the morning of the third day, the wind stopped. Not gradually, not a slow diminishment that gave you time to adjust. It stopped the way it had started a specific moment before and after the sustained roar, simply absent where it had been constant for 72 hours. The silence was more disorienting than the noise had been. She lay still for a long time listening to it, waiting for the next gust. None came. The world outside had gone quiet in the particular way of extreme cold sound itself, suppressed by air too dense and still to carry it far. Niels was sleeping. His breathing was still rough, the wet resonance still present in his chest, but the fever had dropped slightly in the night, and his color was less gray than it had been at midnight. She pressed her palm to his forehead. Still hot, still too hot, but not climbing. She dressed in every layer she owned. She opened the door. The cold hit her face like a physical surface, not a temperature, but a presence, something with edges. Her eyes watered immediately, and the tears froze on her cheeks before they could fall. The moisture of her breath turned to visible crystals in the air in front of her mouth, a small cloud that hung briefly and then settled. The landscape was unrecognizable. Snow had drifted against the north wall of the cabin up to the roofline, a frozen wave that had built over 3 days of continuous wind-driven accumulation. The prairie that she had learned to read over 8 months, the particular role of the land, the line of the creek trees to the northwest, the distant shape of Halvard's cabin to the north, all of it had been erased, replaced by a featureless white plain that merged with the sky at a horizon she could not locate. the boundary between earth and air dissolved by the uniform pale gray of a January morning after the worst blizzard in the memory of anyone living in Otter Tail County. She turned to the south-facing wall and read the thermometer, 38 degrees below zero. She stood in the doorway looking at the white world and thinking about Niels's chest and the medicine she did not have, and the distance to Fergus Falls, which was 18 miles in ordinary conditions, and something considerably different in 5-foot drifts at 38 below zero. And she was in the middle of calculating what was possible and what was not possible when she saw movement. A dark shape, low and slow, moving across the white from the north. It resolved gradually into a human figure, on skis, moving with the rhythmic efficiency of someone who had been on skis since childhood and had not stopped being on skis through 3 days of blizzard. Behind him, something scraped across the crusted snow surface. A small sled. Halvard Nygaard. He reached her cabin 20 minutes after she first saw him. He did not speak until he had come inside and stood by the stove with his body shaking in the involuntary way of someone returning from a temperature that had worked its way past the outer defenses into the core. His hands were white at the fingertips. His beard was solid with ice, his eyebrows crusted, his eyes red-rimmed and weeping from the cold. She gave him hot water with the last spoonful of sugar dissolved in it, a resource she had been rationing since October. He drank it in 3 swallows, his teeth knocking against the rim of the cup. He looked at Niels in the corner. Then he told her about the Halverson family. He said it the way he said everything that was hard in a flat, factual voice from which he had removed the things that would have made it harder to say. The Halverson family lived 2 miles to the southeast. Anders and Britta Halverson, a young couple who had arrived 18 months ago with 2 small children, and the particular combination of hope and inexperience that the frontier attracted and consumed in roughly equal measure. Anders had been a clerk in Chicago before the dream of free land drew him west. Britta had grown up on a Wisconsin farm, but had never experienced a winter that was serious about itself. They had built their cabin in September, moving fast because they had arrived late in the season, and fast was the only option available to them. They had followed the advice of every experienced settler in the area. Logs on packed earth, flat stones at the corners for spacing, good tight chinking a solid roof. The standard construction, the way it was done, the way Peter Haug had told them it should be done because Haug had built that way himself and was still standing after 2 Minnesota winters and believed his survival to be evidence of the method's soundness. The warm spell on the morning of January 12th had let water seep into the soil around the Halverson foundation stones. The cold that followed froze that water with a speed and force that the soil could not absorb. The ice expanded. The southeast corner of the cabin lifted 6 inches in a single night. The logs cracked apart at the corner joint. The chinking fell out in sections, chunks of dried clay and grass dropping from the walls onto the floor while the family slept. By midnight, there was a gap in the wall that the wind entered without restriction. They tried to seal it. Anders stuffed it with blankets, with clothing, with everything he could press into the opening. But the gap kept growing as the ice beneath the corner continued its expansion, and the wind was moving at 60 miles an hour, and the temperature was falling past 40 below. And for every degree the stove produced, the gap in the wall gave back 2. They burned everything they had. The table first, then the chairs, then the bed frame, then the floorboards themselves, Anders prying them up with whatever implement was available and feeding them to the stove while Britta held the children under every piece of fabric that remained. Halvard's voice did not change as he told her this. It remained flat and measured. He had learned in the years since 1883 how to say terrible things without the saying of them breaking him, and he used that skill now. When the fuel ran out, he said they had nothing left to do. He had reached them 2 days after the storm broke, skiing through drifts that reached his waist in the low spots. He told her what he had found inside, and she listened, and she did not ask him to describe it more fully than he did. The youngest child was 4 years old. Her name was Sigrid. She had a blue ribbon in her hair. Britta Halverson had bought it in Chicago before they left, Halvard said, and Sigrid had worn it almost every day since. The way small children attach to particular objects and make them the center of a private world. Halvard had seen the ribbon in October when Britta brought the children to visit, and Sigrid had shown it to Marta with the careful pride of a child who understood that the ribbon was special without quite being able to articulate why. He looked at the table when he told her this part. His hands were wrapped around the cup. Astrid sat across from him and said nothing. There was nothing to say that would change what had happened or reduce what it weighed. She had learned this the same way Halvard had learned it, through the specific education of losing people to cold in the middle of a continent that did not negotiate. She asked how many others. He did not know yet. The storm had lasted 3 days, and people were still digging out, still making the rounds of neighboring claims, still finding what was to be found. He had heard from someone passing that the Peterson family's cabin had dropped 4 inches at the southeast corner during the worst of the storm, and the whole structure was twisted and uninhabitable. The family was alive, barely having spent 2 days burning furniture in a building that was bleeding heat faster than a fire could replace it. He stopped and looked around her cabin. At the walls that showed no frost, at the floor that was level and dry, at the door that hung exactly square in its frame, at the base of the walls where the lowest log sat on its stone pier, with 18 inches of open air between the wood and the frozen earth, the air gap that everyone had told her was wrong, that Auga had called a waste of time, that Birch had said would be her gravestone. Your cabin, Halvard said quietly, is the only one in 3 miles that is not damaged. She nodded. He looked at Niels. She told him about the fever and the chest and the medicine she did not have, and she watched him make the calculation the same way she had made it, the distance to Fergus Falls and the conditions between here and there, and what was possible and what was not. He stood up. His skis were outside. His sled was outside. He had come prepared for something, though she did not know until that moment what the something was. I will go, he said. The road south is broken by the ridge for the first several miles. The drifts are smaller in the lee. I can make Fergus Falls in 8 hours on skis if the crust holds maybe less. There is a doctor there. She looked at him. She thought about May, about a man who had walked away without looking back after telling her the children would freeze. She thought about the flat voice and what it had contained underneath the flatness, the weight of 1883 that he carried every day into every conversation and every decision. He picked up his coat from where she had laid it to warm by the stove. I told you in May that you would fail, he said, that the children would freeze. He did not look at her while he said it. I was telling you what I knew. I had seen what happened to people who stayed when they should have gone, what happened to the cabins they built and the families inside them. He was quiet for a moment. I had not seen this. He gestured at the cabin around them. The gesture taking in the walls and the floor and the door and everything beneath the floor that he could not see but understood now with a completeness he had not possessed in May. I had not seen this, he said again, and I should have. My grandfather built the same way in Seinfeld. He tied his scarf over his face until only his eyes showed. Keep the fire, he said. Keep him elevated when he coughs. I will be back in 3 days. He went out the door, and she watched him cross the clearing on his skis, his figure moving steadily south through the white silence of the post-storm world, growing smaller, until he was a point, and then until he was not visible at all. She closed the door. She went to Niels and adjusted the blankets and held his hand and listened to his breathing and fed the stove. Petter Hauge came on the second day after the storm. He came across the field from the east carrying a sack of flour over his shoulder and not meeting her eyes when she opened the door. He set the sack on the table. He said it was for the children, that he had heard the boy was sick, that he had more than he needed for the rest of the winter. She thanked him. He nodded and stood into the doorway and looked at the cabin the way he had looked at her foundation in July, with the attention of a man who is measuring something against his prior assessment of it and finding the prior assessment wanting. He walked around the outside before he came in properly, his boots on the frozen ground, his eyes going to the stone piers and the gap between the lowest log and the earth. He bent down and examined the nearest pier the way he had examined it in October, pressing his palm against the fitted stones, testing for movement, finding none. He came inside and sat at the table and accepted the thin coffee she made from the last grounds. She had grounds she had already used twice, and he looked at the walls and the floor and the door and the absence of damage in a building that had just endured the same storm that had killed 4 people, 2 miles to the southeast. He said, I told Anders Halvorsen how to build. His voice was flat in a different way than Halvard's was flat. Not the flatness of someone who has learned to carry weight. The flatness of someone newly loaded, still learning the shape of what they are carrying. He said it again. I told him how to build. He came to me in September, him and Britta both asking about construction in this climate, and I told them what I knew. Logs on packed earth, flat stones at the corners, good chinking, a solid roof. I told them to build fast because they were late in the season, and fast was what the situation required. He looked at his hands. She waited. He said, I have been telling people to build that way since I arrived here 2 years ago because that is how I built, and I am still standing, and I believe that to mean it was the right way. He paused. Hauj was a man who did not make speeches and did not draw out what he needed to say, but he was finding this one difficult, and she could see him finding it difficult. I did not kill them. The cold killed them. The storm killed them. He stopped, but I taught them the method that let the cold in. Astrid thought about what he had said. She thought about all the Hoj in all the places the people who passed knowledge down, because it was the knowledge available to them who taught what they had been taught, without examining whether the teaching was sound, who believed that their own survival was evidence of their method's correctness, when in fact it was only evidence that they had not yet encountered the conditions that would test it fully. She thought about Sigrid Halvorsen and the blue ribbon, and the way a piece of knowledge that was simply wrong could travel from one person to another across a community and become the standard and the default, and the way it was done until the winter came, that was cold enough and fast enough and hard enough to reveal what the standard had never been able to survive. She said you taught them what you knew. You could not teach them what you had not learned. He looked up. She said my father taught me when I was 7 years old. I had 30 years of living in America before I needed what he taught me. I cannot call you a fool for not knowing what it took me 30 years to remember. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I need to learn it, the correct way. Before I build anything else, before I advise anyone else, I need to understand what your father understood. She said, come in spring when the ground thaws. I will show you everything. He stayed for 2 hours, and he ate the soup she made from the flour he had brought, and before he left, he shook her hand with the deliberate formality of a man making a commitment that he intended to keep. Halvard returned on the third day. She saw him from the window before he reached the cabin, the familiar shape on skis pulling the small sled behind him, moving through the white landscape at the same steady pace he had left with. He had been gone 2 days and 18 miles in each direction in post-blizzard conditions that she did not allow herself to imagine in full detail because imagining them fully would not have helped anything. He brought medicine from the doctor in Fergus Falls, a small dark bottle with instructions written on a scrap of paper in the doctor's handwriting. 1 spoonful every 4 hours. Keep the patient warm. Keep him drinking water. She measured the first dose with the spoon she used for the children's porridge and coaxed it past Nils's lips. He fought it. The taste made him turn his head, and she was patient and firm, in the way of someone for whom patience and firmness had long since stopped being separate qualities, and he swallowed it. And she gave him water, and she held him upright while the coughing ran its course. By the second dose, his fever had begun to drop. Not dramatically, not the sudden resolution that made good stories. A degree, perhaps, a fraction of a degree, enough that the heat radiating from his skin felt slightly less absolute when she pressed her palm to his forehead. By the third dose, he was sleeping in a way that was different from the restless, labored sleep of the previous 3 days. A deeper stillness. The breathing still rough, the cough still present, but the quality of his unconsciousness changed in a way she recognized from the defensive sleep of a body fighting to the restorative sleep of a body beginning to recover. By morning, when the pale January light came through the greased paper window, his eyes were clear when he opened them. He asked for porridge. She put her hands over her face and stood at the stove and did not move for a long time. Halvard sat at the table and said nothing and let her stand there for as long as she needed to stand there. When she finally lowered her hands and turned around, he was looking at the table, giving her what privacy was possible in a one-room cabin in the middle of January. She wiped her eyes with the hem of her apron and went to make the porridge. He told her the death toll as she worked. He told it carefully in the same flat voice, but she could hear beneath the flatness now the thing he had been carrying since 1883 that had grown heavier since the 13th of January, 1888. At least a dozen families dead across the county. More being discovered as people moved between claims in the aftermath. The Halvorsen family confirmed. Others she knew by name from the store in Fergus Falls, from the brief exchanges of people learning a new place together. He said Solomon Birch is riding through the territory, surveying the damage, offering to buy abandoned claims for half their value. He said it without particular emphasis, but she heard what it contained. She said he told me in June that my foundation would be my gravestone. Halvard said he is telling people now that the settlers who died were simply unprepared, that better materials would have saved them. He is using the disaster to promote his credit operation, the same system that put the Halverson family in a cabin built the wrong way with borrowed money. She thought about Anders Halverson and the $14 Einar had paid to file the claim, and the $14 that seemed to exist in every homesteading story as the entry price to a dream that the territory was not always prepared to honor. She thought about Sigrid and the ribbon. She thought about what she was going to say to Solomon Birch when he came to her door. He came in June when the prairie had finally remembered what warmth was, and the wild plum along the creek had bloomed, and the fields Astrid had broken with the borrowed plow in April were showing their first green. He arrived on a black horse that was too fine for the road and wearing a coat that was too clean for someone who had ridden 18 miles, which meant he had changed before arriving, which told her something about how he wanted this visit to appear. He did not dismount. He said he had come to see how she had fared through the winter. He said it pleasantly with the professional concern of someone who has been in the business of other people's difficulties long enough to have learned what concern should sound like. She stood in the doorway of her cabin and looked at him. She said she had fared well as he could see. He looked at the cabin, his eyes moved over the walls unmarked by frost damage or heave, the door still hanging square and true in its frame. The base of the walls where the stone piers were now partly visible through the grass that had grown up around them, 8 columns of dry stacked granite, sitting exactly where she had placed them the previous summer, bearing the weight of the structure above them without having moved a fraction of an inch. He said her foundation seemed to have performed as she had hoped. She said it had performed as she had known it would. He said he had heard she was teaching the stone pier technique to other settlers, that she was sharing the method freely without charge with anyone who came to ask. She said that was correct. He said that settlers who learned to build this way would not need to borrow money for lumber and cornerstones and the other materials that conventional construction required, that the economic effect of widespread adoption of her method would be a reduction in the credit market that funded frontier development. She listened to him say this. She asked him one question. She asked whether he had extended credit to Anders Halverson in the autumn of 1887 for materials to build a cabin. He looked at her. She asked whether Anders Halverson had used that credit to purchase lumber and cornerstones and the other materials that Birch considered essential for proper frontier construction. He did not answer. She said Sigrid Halverson was 4 years old. She had a blue ribbon in her hair that her mother bought in Chicago before they came west. She froze to death in her mother's arms in a cabin built with your materials on a foundation that failed because it was built the way you and every other man in this territory recommended building it. She looked up at him on his fine horse on the summer road. She said, I will teach anyone who comes to me, and I will charge nothing for the teaching, and if that costs you money, then I suggest you find a different way to earn it. This territory does not need more men who profit from the methods that killed the Halverson family. It needs more people who know how to build something that survives. He looked at her for a long time. Then he turned his horse without speaking and rode back down the road toward Fergus Falls. And she watched him go, and he never came back to her claim. The people came in spring and kept coming. Hans Olsen came first, a big, broad-shouldered farmer with 2 strong sons who could lift stones she could barely budge. She walked them around the foundation, explaining each step the way her father had explained it to her. The selection of flat stones, the fitting of each piece against its neighbors, the tapering of the pier from base to top, so the weight pressed down and locked everything in place, the gaps left for drainage. The Olsen boys learned quickly. By the end of the first day, they had built a pier that was rough but sound, good enough to bear a corner of the new barn their father was planning. Peter Hauge came back in April as he had promised, and he came without the stubbornness and without the prior certainty that had carried him through 2 Minnesota winters and 1 catastrophic blizzard. He came with a notebook and a pencil in the specific humility of a man who has decided to learn something and is prepared to set aside everything he thought he knew in order to learn it properly. She taught him everything: the stone selection, the fitting, the drainage, the mathematics of load distribution that her father had explained to her on summer afternoons in Valdres when she was small enough that the stones he was stacking seemed enormous. He spent 3 days. He came back 2 weeks later with questions that showed he had been practicing and had encountered the problems that practice always produced. She answered the questions. He went away and practiced more. A carpenter from Fergus Falls came in May, a man named Lindmark, who had built a dozen structures in town and considered himself an expert in frontier construction. He walked around the foundation and said nothing for a long time. Then he laughed a short, genuine sound of someone encountering something that overturned an assumption he had held for years. He said he had spent 10 years building things that cracked and heaved every spring and had accepted the cracking and heaving as the nature of the material and the climate. He had not considered that it might be the nature of the foundation. He stayed 2 days and took notes. By the end of summer, 15 new structures in Otter Tail County were rising from dry stone pier foundations built to the specifications that Torkel of Valdres had worked out over a lifetime of building in Norwegian mountains and had packed into the bottom of his daughter's trunk 32 years before she needed them. By the following year, there were 40. The knowledge moved the way knowledge moves when it is genuinely useful from person to person, each one who learned it teaching two more, the circle spreading outward from the one cabin in 3 miles that had stood undamaged through the worst blizzard anyone living in Otter Tail County could remember. Astrid taught everyone who asked. She never charged for it. She always said the same thing when people offered payment. "My father taught me without charge," she said. "That is why I am alive. That is why my grandchildren are alive. The knowledge was given to me as a gift. I will not sell what was given to me freely." She said this to farmers and carpenters and bachelors and young couples with children and old men who had been building wrong for 20 years and were willing at last to reconsider. She said it to Halvard Nygaard, who had been the first person she showed the finished foundation to, and who had since rebuilt his own foundation, and whose door now closed cleanly, and whose floor had not moved in the 2 winters since he rebuilt. She said it to Marta, who was 8 years old in the spring of 1888 and who had sat in the corner of the cabin reading Psalms through 3 days of blizzard and had come out the other side with the particular steadiness of a child who has learned that she can endure what the world sends. She said it to Nils, who was 6 and fully recovered by March, and who spent the spring helping her carry stones to the neighbors who were learning the same work he had done the previous summer with the same seriousness, the small stones that were his to carry, and that he carried without complaint. Astrid Valen proved up her claim in the spring of 1892, 5 years and 1 season from the day she arrived in Otter Tail County with $9 and 2 grandchildren in a trunk containing the only thing she had left. The paperwork filed at the land office in Fergus Falls listed a 16 by 20 cabin, 23 acres of broken sod, a small barn, a root cellar, a chicken coop, and a dry stone pier foundation that the land agent examined with visible curiosity before signing the document and handing it across the counter. He asked how she had learned to build that way. She told him about her father. He nodded as if this answered more than just the question he had asked. She walked out of the land office with the paper in her hand and stood on the main street of Fergus Falls in the April sun and thought about Einar, who had paid $14 for this dream and had not lived to see it fulfilled. She thought about the letter that had arrived in Fargo before Christmas 1886, the pencil sketches in the margins, the plans that had seemed so certain and had run into the thing that all plans eventually run into. She thought about a man who had looked at 160 acres of free land and seen a life. She had gone to build his cabin. She had built it differently than he would have built it with a foundation he might not have thought of using knowledge that came from further back than either of them had gone. She had built it the way her father built things, the way his father had built things, the way people built in mountains where the winters were serious about themselves and the earth moved in ways that did not respect optimism. It had held. She went back to the cabin in the late afternoon, the paper in her coat pocket, and found Marta and Niels in the field. Marta was 12 now, old enough to have absorbed the previous 5 years into something that would stay with her the rest of her life. The particular formation of a child who has been trusted with serious things and has not failed them. Niels was 10 and had his father's face, which she had stopped finding difficult to look at sometime in the 3rd year, and now found simply true the face that belonged to the person who was there. The spring thaw had done what spring thaws in Minnesota always did, push things up through the earth stones that had been buried all winter, working their way back to the surface as the frost retreated. The field was scattered with them, granite cobbles and flat slabs of gneiss and rounded pieces of material that the glaciers had carried 1,000 miles and dropped 10,000 years ago, still arriving at the surface season after season, as if the Earth had an inexhaustible supply of what it wanted to give. Niels found one and called to her. A flat piece of granite gray and speckled the shape her father had called working stone, the flat, regular surface that made it useful for a foundation base. He had worked his fingers under the edge and lifted it free of the soil, and he held it up for her to see. And the weight of it was too much for 10-year-old arms, and he set it down before he dropped it, and he looked up at her with the question in his face. She walked out across the field to where he stood. She bent down and felt the edges of the stone, the flat top surface, the way the sides tapered. She tested its weight, working her fingers under it, straightening her back against what her back had to say about 62-year-old women lifting granite after a winter. She lifted it. She carried it to the pile by the barn, where the stones she had been gathering since March were accumulating against the day when the new barn addition would begin. The one she had promised Halvard she would build with the techniques they had worked out together over 2 winters of observation and adjustment. She set it down. She stood in the spring evening air with her hands on her lower back and looked at the pile, at the stones the earth kept offering. And she kept gathering, and she thought about her father loading these tools into the bottom of a trunk 37 years ago against a day he could not see. She thought about the things that survived, not the things you built to last, not the things you intended to preserve, the things that moved through time in the only way knowledge ever truly moved from one person to another, carried in memory and in practice and in the particular attention that children paid to adults who were doing something real. Marta came and stood beside her. The girl looked at the stone pile, at the field still scattered with what the earth was offering up at the cabin on its foundation 20 yards away. The structure that had stood through the worst winter anyone in Ottertail County could remember and was still standing, the doors still closing, clean, the floor still level, the walls still true. She said the ground will keep pushing up stones, won't it? Every spring. Astrid said yes. Marta said then we'll keep gathering them. Astrid looked at her granddaughter, this 12-year-old who had read Psalms in the dark while her brother was sick and the storm was deciding what it wanted to do, who had carried small stones the previous summer with the same seriousness she brought to everything, who was going to grow up knowing how to build something that the earth could not destroy. Yes, Astrid said, we will. The April evening settled over the field. Somewhere to the north, Halvard Nygaard was stacking the last course of his new barn foundation. Dry stone, no mortar, the weight pressing down and locking everything in place. Somewhere to the east, Petter Hauge was fitting a stone into the pier he was building for his neighbor's new cabin, his hands learning by doing what his grandfather's hands had known by inheritance before the ocean crossing erased it. The earth would keep offering stones. It had been offering them for 10,000 years, pushing the glacial remnants up through the topsoil every spring, irritating the farmers who broke their plows on them, providing the material for the woman who had looked at them and seen what her father had taught her to see. Foundation. Every spring, more stones. Every spring, more people who needed to know what to do with them. The knowledge would keep moving the way her father had trusted it to move from hand to hand, stone by stone, one stubborn life at a time.